If you're brand new to gardening, or even if you've been gardening for a while, it's always a good idea to understand what type of soil you have in your garden. This helps you figure out if anything's missing that your plants are going to need during the growing season, or if you have too much of anything. Now, I've been a big advocate of using compost, but I might have gone a little too far with mine. After I had my soil tested, I learned that my soil had too much nitrogen, which really helps with leaf and stem growth. This made perfect sense to me when I thought about it, because leafy crops like lettuce, Swiss chard, kale, and spinach have done really well in my garden over the years. But too much nitrogen slows down flower formation, and some of my flowering vegetables, like tomatoes and squash, always came in later than I wanted them to. I had read in lots of different places that compost was considered brown gold, and the more that you could add to your garden, the better. So when I built my raised beds, I used equal amounts of soil and compost because I had a giant compost pile. The results of the soil test I had done told me I had too much nitrogen, and they suggested ways to reduce the nitrogen content. So now I'm working on lowering my nitrogen levels so my flowering vegetables will start coming in a little bit sooner. Gardening is a work in process. There are some things that we can test on our own and without needing to send a sample out to a laboratory, but it might make sense to collect soil samples from our garden either now or at the end of the season so we can have our soil tested by a laboratory. Most states have extension services or testing labs that can do this testing for you at a reasonable cost. It's not free, but it will provide valuable information about your garden's soil. These services will tell you how to collect a sample of your soil, and I strongly suggest that you follow all these guidelines as closely as you can. The results from testing your soil will tell you what's in your soil and what's missing. The report you get will usually provide an explanation of what the results mean, and they usually provide suggestions on what you can do to improve your soil. I've put a link below the video to a file that lists testing labs on a state-by-state basis, so you can find one if you want. Now, soil is made up of 4 basic components: sand, silt, clay, and organic matter. Now, the ideal mixture is what we call loam, which roughly consists of equal parts of sand, silt, and clay. For our gardens, the ideal ratio is somewhere around 30% each of sand, silt, and clay, and about 10% organic material. Now, I know that I have more than 10% organic material in my garden. Most of us don't have this ideal ratio, so it will be helpful to figure out what we have so that we know what we should add to get closer to that ideal ratio that will help our plants flourish. Sand helps our soil drain. Not enough sand, and our soil stays waterlogged, and it won't drain after it rains, which may drown our plants because roots need air as well as water. Too much sand means that the water and nutrients will drain too quickly from our soil, and our plants are going to struggle to find enough water and nutrients to grow well. Plants need to be watered all the time because the soil doesn't hold much moisture. Now, clay provides a source of minerals and electrolytes that our plants need. Not enough clay, and our plants will struggle to find some nutrients. Clay has the shape of thin rectangular plates, so too much clay stacked one on top of the other, and these plates will stack and become impervious to water, so the water won't be able to drain, and it won't be able to get in either. Silt is smaller than sand, but larger than clay, so silt holds water a little better than sand, but it doesn't hold nutrients really well. Organic materials come from the breakdown of living things. Compost is organic material that is broken down enough to be useful to the plants we're trying to grow. When we add compost to our gardens, compost starts off as big chunks of organic material. Compost provides nutrients to our plants, and it helps aerate our soil, and in doing so, the compost will break down into smaller and smaller pieces, and it eventually decomposes completely. I know I have too much compost in my garden because the soil level usually drops by an inch or two every single growing season, and I have to add material back in the spring at the start of the growing season. Now, there are some tests we can do ourselves without having to send samples to a lab. These tests will help us learn more about the type of soil we have. The first test you can do is a drainage test. With your garden soil undisturbed, dig out something the size of like a coffee can size cylinder and set the soil aside. With a hose or a watering can, fill the hole with water until it reaches the top. Then let it drain completely, After it's finished draining, fill it again and see how long it takes for the water to drain out of the soil. If it takes more than 5 minutes to drain, you probably have too much clay. If it takes less than 30 seconds to drain, you probably have too much sand. Now I have a lot of compost in my garden, so my soil drains pretty quickly because of all the airspace between the compost particles, but the organic matter also holds on to plenty of moisture. Now the next test you can do is a settling test. You'll need a clear plastic or glass container with a cover that holds about a quart. Go out to your garden and dig up an area and thoroughly mix, like a 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot deep area. And when everything's well mixed, use a plastic container to collect a sample of that soil. Take all the weeds and any rocks over about a 1/4 inch of size out. Now take that clear glass or plastic container and fill it about halfway with this soil. Now add water to the glass until the jar is about 3/4 full. Cover it up, shake it up, and set it down and let it sit overnight. When you come back the next day, the organic material will have floated to the top and all the sand, silt, and clay will be settled to the bottom. Now it might be hard to see, but sand and rocks will always settle to the bottom first, silt will be next, and clay will be on top. You might be able to see 3 distinct layers, and if you can, you'll be able to see what the ratios are. Now the water may still look a little cloudy or muddy, and that's okay. Right? You want about 10% of your garden soil to be organic material. That's the stuff that floats. And then you want approximately equal amounts of the other 3 layers, sand, silt, and clay. Now you can also check the pH of your soil. You'll need a pH test kit for this, which you can get at a pool supply store for under $10. Now they have drop tests and I guess what they call dipstick tests. And for this test, I would strongly recommend you use a dipstick style test. Test your tap water for pH and then grab a little bit of the water that you just used in the settling test and compare the pH values. If the pH of your tap water is higher than the water that came from your soil, your water is a little bit on the acidic side and you may need to add some lime. If the pH of your tap water is lower than the water that came from your soil, you may need to add sulfur compound or possibly peat moss or compost. One of the other things you should be looking for with your garden soil is how many rocks there are. Rocks will interfere with root growth, which is particularly important if you're trying to grow root crops like carrots, parsnips, beets, that kind of stuff. If you have a lot of rocks, you might want to use a screen to remove them. You can remove the larger rocks by hand when you're turning your soil over. But when I got serious about gardening, I sifted all the soil that went into my garden through a 1/2-inch screen that I built to fit over a wheelbarrow. Check out the next video to see how important it is to optimize your garden soil.